Hey guys, settle here. Tonight, we begin with something that sounds harmless, but in medieval Europe would have been treated like a quiet disaster. So before we start, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always interesting to see how far this little medieval campfire has traveled. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's story together. Tonight, we begin with something that sounds harmless, but in medieval Europe would have been treated like a quiet disaster. Not war. Not plague. Not invasion. Not even the collapse of a kingdom. Tonight, we begin with something far more morally complicated. Flavor. Because in the Middle Ages, flavor was not simply a feature of food. It was not a preference. It was not a harmless detail, like choosing one type of bread over another, or deciding whether you liked your stew thicker or thinner. Flavor was a moral event. It was a spiritual atmosphere. It was a suspicious sensation that arrived in the mouth without asking permission, and then lingered there like a dangerous thought. And medieval people, especially the ones who wrote sermons, manuals, religious rules, and medical guides, were deeply uncomfortable with anything that arrived without permission and felt good. So before we ease into this long story, do what you usually do. Dim the lights. Let the room cool down. Maybe put a fan on low so there's that soft hum in the background, the kind that makes your thoughts feel slow and distant. And if you're listening in bed, get comfortable. Because the medieval world we're about to enter is not one where people were starving constantly, or eating nothing but gruel, or wandering around in a permanent state of misery. That is the version of medieval life people often imagine. And it's partly true. But it's not the whole truth. The medieval world was, in many places, full of food. It was full of cooking. It was full of meals that were carefully prepared. And it was full of people trying very hard to enjoy those meals without looking like they were enjoying them. Because the real danger, in medieval thinking, was not hunger. Hunger was acceptable. Hunger was expected. Hunger proved that the world was still functioning correctly. The real danger was satisfaction. Satisfaction meant you had been comforted. And comfort meant you might stop striving. And if you stopped striving, you might stop praying. And if you stopped praying, you might start thinking your life was fine. And if you started thinking your life was fine, you were basically announcing to heaven that you didn't need it that much. Which, in medieval logic, was an extremely bold thing to do. So the medieval relationship with food was not simply about scarcity. It was about suspicion. It was about the idea that pleasure was never neutral. That the body was not a trusted partner. That the senses were not reliable. And that anything that made the senses happy was potentially trying to smuggle sin into your soul. In other words, medieval Europe treated dinner the way modern people treat social media. You know it's not inherently evil. You know you need it sometimes. But you also know, deep down, that if you enjoy it too much, something is probably going wrong. And medieval people were raised inside a worldview where the human body was not simply a body. It was a battlefield. It was a constant negotiation between what you wanted and what you were supposed to want. Between what felt good and what was good. Between what the senses demanded and what the soul demanded. And the soul, according to medieval religion, demanded restraint. Not because restraint was pleasant, but because restraint proved you were not an animal, that it proved you were not governed by appetite. It proved you were capable of saying no to something you wanted. And that ability, the ability to deny yourself, was considered the foundation of spiritual life. So food became one of the most common testing grounds. Not because food was rare. But because food was daily. And anything daily was dangerous. Because anything daily could become a habit. And habits were powerful. And if your daily habit involved pleasure, then pleasure could become normal. And if pleasure became normal, then you might stop noticing it. And if you stopped noticing it, you might stop feeling guilty about it. And guilt, in medieval Christianity, was not simply an emotional response. It was a spiritual alarm system. It was supposed to activate quickly. It was supposed to keep you vigilant. It was supposed to make sure you never became too comfortable. So medieval morality, in many ways, was built around the idea of controlled discomfort. Not misery, exactly. Not constant pain. But a steady background sense that you were not supposed to be too happy. And the reason for that was simple. Happiness was not considered the natural state of human beings. The natural state of human beings was struggle. Earth was not a place you were meant to enjoy fully. Earth was a place you were meant to endure. It was a test. It was preparation. It was temporary. And if you got too attached to it, too comfortable in it, too pleased by it, then you were at risk of forgetting the larger story. The eternal story. The afterlife. The salvation narrative. So anything that made Earth feel too pleasant was spiritually suspicious. And food, unfortunately, was extremely good at making Earth feel pleasant. A warm bowl of stew on a cold night. Fresh bread. A little honey. A piece of cheese. A properly cooked fish. A roast with herbs. A sip of spiced wine. These things did not just feed the body. They softened the world. They made life feel bearable. And medieval thinkers, especially religious ones, were deeply uneasy about anything that made life bearable. Because bearable life could lead to contentment. And contentment was the most suspicious emotion in the medieval moral universe. Contentment meant you weren't desperate enough. Contentment meant you weren't suffering properly. Contentment meant you might start living as if this world was the point. And that was unacceptable. So food became moral. Not only in the obvious ways, like fasting rules and religious restrictions, but in subtle ways. In how you ate. How quickly. How eagerly. How much attention you paid to the taste. Whether you smiled while chewing. Whether you asked for more. Whether you praised the cook. Whether you reached for the best piece. Whether you ate in silence or talked. Whether you ate alone. Whether you ate in public. Whether you ate at the correct hour. Whether you ate with gratitude. Whether you ate with restraint. Whether you ate like someone who could stop at any moment. Even if you couldn't. Because medieval morality was, in many ways, performative. It wasn't enough to be disciplined. You had to look disciplined. You had to appear as though you were not being tempted. You had to eat as though the food was slightly disappointing. Not because the cook was bad. But because your soul was supposed to be stronger than your senses. So ideally, the medieval diner would look mildly unimpressed at all times. Not angry. Not miserable. Just faintly detached. Like someone who was only eating because their body required it. And this is why medieval moral discussions about food are so stressful to read. Because they are not describing some obvious crime. They are describing tiny, everyday behaviors. They are describing the kind of habits you would never notice. The kind of things people do automatically. They are describing the natural human experience of enjoying a meal. And they are treating that natural human experience as a spiritual hazard. Gluttony, for example, was not simply eating too much. That is the modern version. Medieval gluttony was far more complicated. It included eating too early. Eating too late. Eating too often. Eating too quickly. Eating too eagerly. Eating too delicately. Eating food that was too expensive. Eating food that was too carefully prepared. Eating food that was too pleasurable. Eating food because you wanted it, not because you needed it. Eating with anticipation. Eating with excitement. Eating in private. Eating alone. Eating with too much attention. Eating with too much joy. Eating without the correct amount of guilt. And if you're noticing the pattern, yes. Eventually, just eating at all began to feel morally risky. Which was the point? The medieval moral system did not want you to relax. It wanted you to monitor yourself. Constantly. Because self-monitoring was seen as spiritual discipline. So even when you were doing something as ordinary as eating a piece of bread, you were expected to do it with awareness. Not mindful awareness, the modern kind that's supposed to calm you. Medieval awareness was supposed to make you nervous. It was supposed to remind you that you were always on the edge of temptation. Always one enjoyable bite away from losing control. And control was everything. Because the medieval fear was not food itself. The medieval fear was the body. The body was considered impulsive. Hungry. Lazy. Sexual. Demanding. The body wanted comfort. The body wanted warmth. The body wanted to stop working. The body wanted to feel good. And medieval thinkers believed that if you gave the body what it wanted too often, it would grow stronger. It would demand more. It would become difficult to manage. And once the body was difficult to manage, the soul would become weak. And once the soul was weak, the devil had options. So food became part of spiritual warfare. A battlefield where the enemy was not a foreign army. The enemy was your appetite. And flavor was one of the most dangerous weapons appetite had. Because flavor made food more than survival. It made food attractive. It made food desirable. It made food something you looked forward to. And looking forward to something, in medieval spirituality, was already suspicious. Because you were supposed to look forward to heaven. Not dinner. You were supposed to crave salvation. Not stew. You were supposed to hunger for God. Not bread. So the more a meal felt pleasurable, the more it felt like a rival. And medieval morality did not like rivals. Now, it's important to say something here. Not everyone in medieval Europe lived like a monk. Not everyone sat at the table thinking, if I chew too happily, I will be damned. Most ordinary people were not theologians. They were farmers. Craftsmen. Mothers. Children. Servants. Laborers. And they were too busy surviving to micromanage their facial expressions while eating. But medieval culture was still soaked in religious ideas. The church was not a distant institution. It was present. It was local. It was the calendar. It was the rhythm of life. It told you when you could eat meat. When you could not. When you had to fast. When you had to abstain. When you had to feast. And those rules affected everyone. Even if they didn't understand the theology behind them. So the moral suspicion of food existed everywhere. It existed in sermons. In confession manuals. In monastery rules. In medical writing. In social expectations. In the way people talked about rich food. In the way people judged each other's habits. And in the quiet guilt people carried around without necessarily naming it. Because medieval Europe was a world where guilt was considered useful. Guilt was not a psychological problem. It was a spiritual tool. It kept you humble. It kept you cautious. It kept you obedient. And obedience was the foundation of medieval society. Not just religious obedience, but social obedience. If you obeyed God, you were more likely to obey the church. If you obeyed the church, you were more likely to obey your Lord. It made food attractive. It made food desirable. It made food something you looked forward to. And looking forward to something, in medieval spirituality, was already suspicious. Because you were supposed to look forward to heaven. Not dinner. You were supposed to crave salvation. Not stew. You were supposed to hunger for God. Not bread. So the more a meal felt pleasurable, the more it felt like a rival. And medieval morality did not like rivals. Now, it's important to say something here. Not everyone in medieval Europe lived like a monk. Not everyone sat at the table thinking, if I chew too happily, I will be damned. Most ordinary people were not theologians. They were farmers, craftsmen, mothers, children, servants, laborers. And they were too busy surviving to micromanage their facial expressions while eating. But medieval culture was still soaked in religious ideas. The church was not a distant institution. It was present. It was local. It was the calendar. It was the rhythm of life. It told you when you could eat meat. When you could not. When you had to fast. When you had to abstain. When you had to feast. And those rules affected everyone. Even if they didn't understand the theology behind them. So the moral suspicion of food existed everywhere. It existed in sermons. In confession manuals. In monastery rules. In medical writing. In social expectations. In the way people talked about rich food. In the way people judged each other's habits. And in the quiet guilt people carried around without necessarily naming it. Because medieval Europe was a world where guilt was considered useful. Guilt was not a psychological problem. It was a spiritual tool. It kept you humble. It kept you cautious. It kept you obedient. And obedience was the foundation of medieval society. Not just religious obedience, but social obedience. If you obeyed God, you were more likely to obey the church. If you obeyed the church, you were more likely to obey your Lord. If you obeyed your Lord, you were more likely to obey the social order. So moralizing food was not just about religion. It was also about control. Because when you can control what people eat, when they eat, how they eat, and how they feel while eating, you can control their behavior in general. And medieval society loved control. It was built on it. So now, with that atmosphere established, we can finally arrive at the subject of tonight's long story. Spices. Because spices were the ultimate medieval food problem. They were expensive. They were rare. They were exotic. They were associated with wealth. They were associated with pleasure. They were associated with medicine. They were associated with desire. They were associated with foreign lands and strange people and trade routes and markets and luxury. And they were, most importantly, associated with flavor. Real flavor. The kind of flavor that did not feel humble. The kind of flavor that did not feel accidental. The kind of flavor that announced itself. The kind of flavor that made food taste intentionally good. And that was the issue. Spices made food taste like someone had tried. And trying to make food taste good was already morally suspicious. Because it suggested you were not simply eating to live. You were living to eat. And that, in medieval moral terms, was the beginning of the end. Now, in the modern imagination, medieval people are often portrayed as eating bland food because they didn't have access to spices. This is partly wrong. Spices were available. Not to everyone, not in huge quantities, but they were present. Pepper, cinnamon, ginger, cloves, nutmeg, saffron, galangal, long pepper, grains of paradise. These were known. They were traded. They were sold. They were used. And in wealthy households, they were used generously. Sometimes shockingly generously. Because medieval elite cooking did not aim for subtlety. It aimed for display. It aimed for sensory impact. It aimed for richness. And spices were a way of showing that you could afford not only food, but flavor. Because spices were not necessary for survival. They were unnecessary. They were extra. They were pure enhancement. And enhancement, in medieval morality, was suspicious. Because enhancement meant you were seeking pleasure beyond need. And pleasure beyond need was the definition of indulgence. So spices became morally complicated. Not officially banned. Not forbidden in the way meat was forbidden on fasting days. But watched. Judged. Talked about. Associated with weakness. Associated with luxury. Associated with sin. And the more you look at medieval writing, the more you see that spices occupy a strange position. They are praised as medicine. They are praised as warming. They are praised as useful. And at the same time, they are feared. Because warming was not always good. Warming could mean inflaming. Warming could mean stirring. Warming could mean awakening passions. And passions were dangerous. So spices were treated like a kind of edible temptation. A temptation that could be justified if you framed it correctly. If you said you were using pepper because your stomach was cold. If you said you were using cinnamon because your digestion was weak. If you said you were using ginger because you needed to balance your humors. If you said you were using cloves because your breath needed cleansing. If you said you were using saffron because it lifted your spirits, which, in medieval medicine, could be described as treating melancholy. Then spices were acceptable. Because they were medicinal. But if you used spices simply because they tasted good, then you were no longer practicing medicine. You were practicing pleasure. And pleasure was always one step away from sin. So medieval people developed a complicated relationship with spices. A relationship based on loopholes. On excuses. On careful framing. On moral language. On pretending you were not enjoying yourself. And this is one of the most consistent patterns in medieval life. People wanted comfort. People wanted pleasure. People wanted warmth. People wanted good food. But they lived inside a culture that demanded restraint. So they learned to enjoy things quietly. They learned to hide enjoyment inside moral justification. They learned to call pleasure medicine. They learned to call indulgence necessity. They learned to call luxury weakness. They learned to call desire health. And in doing so, they created a world where people could eat richly while still appearing pious. They could feast while still claiming to fast. They could enjoy while still claiming to suffer. And that was the medieval ideal. Not true deprivation. But controlled, supervised, socially acceptable enjoyment. Enjoyment with guilt. Enjoyment with a sermon attached. Enjoyment with an excuse. Because medieval society did not want people to be miserable. It just wanted them to be dependent. Dependent on religion. Dependent on authority. Dependent on the moral system. So it allowed pleasure, but only in forms that could be regulated. And spices were one of the most perfect examples of this. Because spices were pleasurable, but they could be explained. They were delicious, but they could be justified. They were indulgent, but they could be described as necessary. They were luxury, but they could be framed as health. And medieval people loved that kind of loophole. They lived on it. Now, to understand why spices became so morally charged, we have to understand the medieval worldview around the body. And this is where things get especially strange. Because medieval people did not think about the body the way we do. They did not think about nutrition. They did not think about calories. They did not think about vitamins. They did not think about metabolism. They did not think about the digestive system as a mechanical process. They thought about the body as a balance. A balance of fluids. A balance of temperatures. A balance of qualities. Hot and cold. Wet and dry. And they believed that food directly shaped this balance. So food was not simply fuel. Food was mood. Food was temperament. Food was morality. Food was personality. You didn't just eat beef. You ate heat. You didn't just eat fish. You ate coldness. You didn't just eat cheese. You ate heaviness. You didn't just eat sugar. You ate softness. And spices were considered extremely powerful in this system. Because spices were hot. Not spicy hot necessarily, but hot in the medical sense. They were warming. They were drying. They were stimulating. And that meant they could change you. They could alter your behavior. They could make you more energetic. More aggressive. More lustful. More impulsive. More awake. More excited. More alive. And medieval moral thinkers were suspicious of anything that made you feel more alive. Because feeling alive meant feeling attached to life. And being attached to life meant being less attached to God. So spices became a strange kind of moral technology. A way of controlling the body. Or losing control of it. Depending on how you used them. And in medieval culture, the loss of control was one of the greatest fears. Because sin, at its core, was defined as disorder. Sin was not simply breaking a rule. Sin was allowing something lower to rule something higher. Allowing the body to rule the soul. Allowing appetite to rule reason. Allowing desire to rule discipline. Allowing pleasure to rule duty. So spices, which stirred appetite and made food more desirable, were seen as a threat to hierarchy. Not social hierarchy, though they threatened that too. But spiritual hierarchy. The hierarchy inside the human being. Soul above body. Reason above appetite. Discipline above desire. Spices blurred that line. They made appetite louder. They made desire more persuasive. They made the body feel more convincing. And that was dangerous. Because medieval people believed the body was always trying to negotiate. Always trying to convince you. Always trying to win. And spices were like giving the body a lawyer. A very expensive lawyer. Now, if all of this sounds extreme, it is. But medieval Europe was extreme in many ways. Not because people were foolish. But because they lived in a world where survival was uncertain. Where death was close. Where disease was common. Where life was fragile. And when life is fragile, people become obsessed with meaning. They become obsessed with the idea that everything matters. That every choice has consequences. That every action reveals something about your soul. And food, because it was constant, became one of the most heavily moralized parts of life. Because it was a place where temptation was guaranteed. You could avoid many sins by simply not having the opportunity. You might never have the opportunity to steal. You might never have the opportunity to commit violence. You might never have the opportunity to commit adultery. But you always had the opportunity to eat. So food became the daily spiritual test. The one you could not avoid. The one you had to face. And spices made that test harder. Because spices made food interesting. They made it exciting. They made it pleasurable. They made it something you could crave. And craving was dangerous. Craving was the language of desire. And desire was the root of many sins. So the medieval fear of spices was not just about flavor. It was about what flavor represented. A world where you could seek pleasure. A world where you could enjoy yourself. A world where you could make life more comfortable. A world where you could make the body happy. And medieval moral thinkers were convinced that a happy body was a rebellious body. So they watched spices carefully. They argued about them. They wrote about them. They prescribed them as medicine and condemned them as indulgence. They used them and felt guilty. They served them and pretended it was necessary. They enjoyed them and hid the enjoyment behind pious language. And that is what makes this topic so perfect for an 8 to 9 hour bedtime history script. Because spices are not just a culinary detail. They are a window into the medieval mind. A mind that believed the world was full of invisible dangers. A mind that believed pleasure was never innocent. A mind that believed the body was always trying to ruin you. A mind that believed that even a good meal could become a spiritual problem. And tonight, we are going to live inside that mind. Slowly. Gently. Piece by piece. Until spices stop being spices. And start being what they were in medieval Europe. A moral emergency. A luxury scandal. A medical tool. A social weapon. A religious loophole. And a small, fragrant reminder that medieval people were terrified of happiness. Now, in the next part, we're going to step fully into medieval medicine. Because you cannot understand medieval fear of flavor without understanding the medieval belief system that supported it. The system that made people think a pinch of pepper could stir lust. A system that made people think cinnamon could soften the soul. A system that made people think nutmeg could warm the blood in ways that encouraged bad decisions. A system that made people believe food didn't just feed you. It shaped you. It made you into a certain kind of person. And the kind of person spices made you into, was not a person medieval morality trusted. If you want to understand why medieval Europe treated spices like a spiritual hazard, you have to understand something that shaped almost every serious conversation about food for centuries. Not religion. Not politics. Not war. But medicine. Because medieval people didn't think of food as fuel. They didn't think of it as nutrition. They didn't think in terms of protein, vitamins, calories, or metabolism. They thought in terms of balance. And the balance they were obsessed with was not the balance of meals. It was the balance of the body itself. A medieval person did not imagine their body as a machine. They imagined it as a landscape. A landscape full of fluids. A landscape full of temperatures. A landscape full of qualities. And those qualities were constantly shifting, constantly drifting, constantly threatening to slide out of control. So in medieval medicine, your health was not something you simply had. Health was something you maintained. Like keeping a fire at the right temperature. Like keeping a room from becoming too damp. Like keeping a ship steady in rough water. And the moment that balance slipped, illness appeared. Not just physical illness, but emotional illness. Spiritual weakness. Mood changes. Energy changes. Personality changes. And in medieval thinking, those things were not separate. Your body, your emotions, and your moral character were all tangled together. Which meant that food was never just food. It was a tool. A lever. A dial you could adjust to change who you were. And if you adjusted it wrong, you didn't just get indigestion. You became a worse person. This is the part of medieval life that modern people often underestimate. Medieval people were not simply religious. They were medical. They were obsessed with the idea that your body was fragile and unstable. That it could be influenced by air, seasons, weather, sleep, sex, emotions, and especially food. And the medical system they relied on was what we now call humoral theory. The theory of the four humors. Now, the humors were not jokes. They were not metaphors. They were not poetic. They were treated as real substances inside the body. Real fluids. Real forces. And medieval medicine believed that the body contained four primary humors. Blood. Phlegm. Yellow bile. Black bile. And each of these humors had qualities. Blood was hot and wet. Phlegm was cold and wet. Yellow bile was hot and dry. Black bile was cold and dry. And the ideal human body, the healthy body, was one where these humors were balanced. Not perfectly equal, because no one was perfectly equal. But balanced enough that you functioned properly. And here's where it gets interesting. Because in medieval thinking, your humor balance didn't just determine your physical health. It determined your temperament. Your personality. Your emotional style. The way you behaved. So if you had too much blood, you were sanguine. Warm. Energetic. Sociable. Optimistic. Possibly reckless. If you had too much phlegm, you were phlegmatic. Calm. Slow. Sleepy. Dull. Possibly lazy. If you had too much yellow bile, you were choleric. Irritable. Aggressive. Driven. Angry. Quick to fight. If you had too much black bile, you were melancholic. Sad. Thoughtful. Heavy. Anxious. Withdrawn. And medieval people believed these were not just personality types. They were physical states. They were bodily conditions. Which meant they could be influenced. And the primary way to influence them was diet. Because food, in medieval thinking, had qualities too. Food was not just meat or bread. Food was hot, cold, wet, dry. Food carried temperament. Food carried moral energy. And when you ate, you weren't just filling your stomach. You were adjusting your internal climate. You were altering your humors. You were changing the temperature of your blood. The dryness of your bile. The heaviness of your phlegm. So food became a form of self-management. Not in the modern wellness sense. But in the medieval survival sense. Because if you ate wrongly, you didn't just feel sick. You became unstable. You became emotionally unreliable. You became impulsive. You became sluggish. You became prone to sin. And that's where the religious fear of food fused perfectly with the medical fear of food. Because medieval religion already believed that the body was a source of temptation. And medieval medicine gave that belief a scientific structure. It gave it an explanation. It gave it a system. It made the fear of food feel rational. Because now it wasn't just priests saying, "Don't enjoy dinner too much." It was physicians saying, "Enjoying dinner too much will literally heat your blood and weaken your self-control." So pleasure became medical. Sin became physiological. And spices, which were classified as hot and dry, became especially alarming. Because hot and dry foods were believed to stimulate the body. They were believed to increase yellow bile. They were believed to sharpen appetite. They were believed to inflame desire. And desire, in medieval morality, was the root problem. Because desire was what pulled you away from discipline. Desire was what made you impulsive. Desire was what made you break rules. Desire was what made you seek pleasure. And pleasure, again, was not considered neutral. Pleasure was considered a force. A force that weakened reason. A force that made you less watchful. Less careful. Less spiritually alert. So if you think about it, medieval humoral theory wasn't just medicine. It was a moral technology. It was a way of explaining why self-control mattered. It was a way of describing sin as something that could be triggered by physical conditions. And that meant that food wasn't just a temptation. It was a mechanism. A mechanism that could create temptation. So spices were dangerous not only because they tasted good, but because they were believed to do something inside you. They were believed to heat you. Dry you. Awaken you. And awakening was not always good. Because awakening could mean arousal. And arousal, in medieval thinking, was one of the most dangerous bodily states. Now, it's worth pausing here for a moment. Because modern people often laugh at humoral theory. And yes, it is wrong. It is not medically accurate. It does not describe the body correctly. But it did something very important for medieval society. It provided a framework. A framework that made the world feel explainable. Because medieval life was unpredictable. Disease could strike suddenly. People could die quickly. Infections could spread. Food could spoil. Weather could destroy crops. Children could die in infancy. Accidents were common. Pain was common. And when you live in a world like that, you crave explanations. You crave patterns. You crave systems. Humoral theory gave medieval people a system. A way of understanding why the body behaved the way it did. A way of explaining why someone was energetic and someone else was sluggish. Why someone was angry and someone else was sad. Why someone had fevers. Why someone had chills. Why someone fainted. Why someone was depressed. Why someone was anxious. Why someone was aggressive. Why someone was horny. And yes, medieval medicine did not shy away from that. Desire was treated as a medical issue. Not only a moral one. If someone was overly lustful, it could be blamed on hot blood. If someone was overly sleepy, it could be blamed on phlegm. If someone was overly angry, it could be blamed on bile. So the body became a kind of moral chemistry set. And food became one of the primary ingredients. This meant that when medieval people talked about hot foods, they were not speaking metaphorically. They genuinely believed that some foods produced heat inside the body. That some foods warmed the blood. That some foods dried the humors. That some foods thickened them. That some foods made you more energetic. That some foods made you sluggish. That some foods made you more prone to anger. That some foods made you more prone to sadness. And spices were considered one of the most intense categories. Because spices were concentrated. They were not bulk foods. They were not eaten as the main substance of a meal. They were added. In small amounts. And yet they were believed to have powerful effects. Because they were strong. Sharp. Pungent. Aromatic. They felt like they were doing something. Even in the mouth. Even on the tongue. They created sensation. And sensation, in medieval moral thinking, was always suspicious. Because sensation was the doorway. The doorway into pleasure. And pleasure was the doorway into sin. So you can already see how this becomes a perfect storm. Religion says, control your senses. Medicine says, your senses control your body. Therefore, food controls your morality. And spices, which excite the senses, must be treated carefully. Now, to make this even more complicated, medieval medicine didn't just classify foods as hot or cold, wet or dry. It also classified people. Because medieval medicine believed that individuals had natural temperaments. Some people were naturally warmer. Some naturally colder. Some naturally wetter. Some naturally drier. Some were naturally more sanguine, some more melancholic. And because of this, food was not one size fits all. The same food could be good for one person and bad for another. A young man, for example, was considered naturally hot. Youth was hot. Youth was active. Youth was full of blood and energy. So young men were already considered prone to lust and impulsiveness. Which is convenient, because medieval sermons were also obsessed with warning young men not to become morally unstable. So young men were advised to avoid foods that heated them further. Like meat. Like wine. Like spices. Like rich sauces. Like sugar. Because those foods would inflame their natural heat. And once inflamed, the young man might become reckless. He might become aggressive. He might become lustful. He might become lazy. He might become sinful. Meanwhile, an older person was considered naturally cold. Aging was cold. Aging was dry. Aging was slow. So older people were often advised to eat warming foods. Including spices. Because spices could help them digest. Help them circulate blood. Help them maintain energy. Help them stay alive. So spices, in this system, could be both dangerous and medicinal. They could be a temptation for the young and a treatment for the old. They could be indulgence for the healthy and medicine for the weak. They could be sin for one person and necessity for another. Which, of course, made them morally confusing. Because medieval morality loved clear lines. It loved rules. It loved categories. But spices refused to stay in one category. They were too useful. Too pleasurable. Too expensive. Too symbolic. So they existed in that medieval gray zone. The zone where people did something and then immediately wrote a justification for it. Now, this is also where medieval food culture becomes deeply social. Because spices were not just medical. They were status. Spices were wealth in edible form. They were proof that you had access to trade networks. Proof that you had money. Proof that you were connected. Proof that you could afford not only food, but imported flavor. And medieval society was extremely sensitive to status. Because medieval society was hierarchical. And food was one of the most visible ways of displaying hierarchy. What you ate was a public statement. Not just about your wealth, but about your moral position. Because wealth itself was morally complicated. The church did not exactly condemn wealth outright. But it distrusted it. It warned that wealth encouraged pride. It warned that wealth encouraged luxury. It warned that wealth encouraged indulgence. It warned that wealth made people forget God. So rich food was morally suspicious. And spices were the richest kind of food. Not in quantity. But in symbolism. A dish seasoned with saffron was not just a dish. It was an announcement. It was saying, I can afford to make my food golden. And making your food golden was not necessary. It was display. It was aesthetic pleasure. It was the culinary equivalent of wearing jewelry. And medieval moral thinkers were suspicious of jewelry too. Because jewelry was unnecessary. It was decoration. It was an attempt to make life more beautiful. And medieval spirituality, especially the strict kind, was deeply uncomfortable with beauty that existed for its own sake. Beauty was allowed when it served God. Church art, stained glass, illuminated manuscripts. Beauty that pointed upward. Beauty that reminded you of heaven. But beauty for personal pleasure was risky. It suggested vanity. It suggested attachment to the world. It suggested that you cared too much about the senses. So spices, which made food more beautiful, more fragrant, more pleasurable, were treated like edible vanity. Now, this is where we can begin to see the real medieval fear. Because medieval people did not fear flavor simply because it tasted good. They feared it because it was persuasive. Flavor convinced you. It made you want more. It made you look forward to meals. It made you emotionally invested in eating. An emotional investment in eating was, in medieval terms, a sign of spiritual weakness. You were supposed to eat as if you could stop. You were supposed to eat as if the food didn't matter. You were supposed to eat as if you were above it. And spices made that harder. Because spices made food interesting. And interest is the beginning of attachment. And attachment is the beginning of desire. And desire is the beginning of sin. So spices weren't just food. They were a chain reaction. A domino effect. A small pinch of pepper that could, theoretically, end in moral collapse. Now, to make this even more strange, medieval people also believed that the senses themselves were morally dangerous. Not just taste. All of them. Sight. Smell. Touch. Hearing. Taste. These were the portals. The entry points. The ways the world entered you. And medieval moral thinkers believed that the devil could use the senses. That temptation entered through the senses. That pleasure entered through the senses. That distraction entered through the senses. So sensory experiences were treated with caution. This is why medieval sermons often warn against music that is too pleasing. Against dancing. Against luxurious clothing. Against perfumes. Against soft bedding. Against warm baths. Against laughter that goes too far. Against storytelling that excites the imagination. Against anything that makes the senses too happy. Because senses were seen as slippery. They bypassed reason. They went straight to desire. And desire went straight to sin. So spices, which affect taste and smell strongly, were doubly dangerous. They didn't just taste good. They smelled good. They filled the room. They lingered. They made the entire meal an experience. And medieval morality did not like experiences. It liked duty. Now, at this point, you might be thinking. If medieval people were so suspicious of pleasure, how did anyone enjoy anything? The answer is, they did. Constantly. But they did it with guilt. Or they did it with justification. Or they did it in socially acceptable ways. Or they did it quietly. Or they did it while pretending they weren't. And this is one of the most human parts of medieval life. Because medieval people were not robots. They were not living in constant misery. They laughed. They celebrated. They enjoyed meals. They flirted. They drank. They sang. They played games. They told jokes. They made fun of priests. They made fun of each other. They were human. But the official culture, the culture of sermons and rules, was always trying to keep human joy on a leash. Not eliminate it entirely. Just regulate it. Because regulated joy was safe. Unregulated joy was dangerous. So spices became a symbol of unregulated joy. A symbol of pleasure that could spread. Because once you started seasoning your food, you might want more seasoning. Once you started enjoying flavor, you might start caring about taste. Once you started caring about taste, you might start caring about comfort. Once you started caring about comfort, you might start caring about your body. Once you started caring about your body, you might start caring about other bodily pleasures. And the medieval imagination was extremely good at building slippery slopes. Everything was connected. Everything led somewhere. Everything had consequences. So spices became, in a way, a moral metaphor. A metaphor for the danger of small indulgences. Now, medieval moral writing often describes sin in exactly these terms. Sin is rarely portrayed as a sudden dramatic collapse. It is portrayed as a gradual drift. A slow loosening of discipline. A small indulgence. Then another. Then another. Until you no longer notice that you have changed. Until you no longer notice that you are living differently. Until you wake up one day and realize your life is filled with comfort and pleasure. And you haven't thought about God properly in weeks. So spices, because they were small, because they were incremental, because they were added rather than eaten in bulk, fit perfectly into this narrative. They were the ideal symbol of gradual indulgence. A pinch today. A little more tomorrow. A rich sauce next week. A feast next month. A life of luxury by next year. And medieval moral thinkers were terrified of that drift. Because drift was hard to control. Drift was subtle. Drift could happen without intention. And medieval morality hated unintentional sin. Not because it was less sinful, but because it was harder to detect. It was harder to confess. Harder to correct. Harder to monitor. So the medieval solution was constant vigilance. Monitor yourself. Monitor your appetite. Monitor your enjoyment. Monitor your desire. Monitor your senses. Monitor your thoughts. Monitor your dreams. Monitor your feelings. Monitor your reactions. Because if you didn't, you might drift. And drifting was how people ended up in spiritual danger. Now, the humor system reinforced this. Because humoral theory suggested that small changes in diet could produce large changes in temperament. A little more heat. A little more dryness. a little more moisture. And suddenly your mood shifted. Suddenly your behavior shifted. Suddenly your desires shifted. So spices, classified as hot and dry, were treated as mood shifters. As temperament shapers. As bodily stimulants. And this made them morally relevant. Because if food shaped temperament, then food shaped morality. And if food shaped morality, then food was not just personal. It was communal. It affected society. It affected order. It affected the spiritual health of the community. So what you ate wasn't just your business. It was everyone's business. Because medieval society was deeply communal. People lived close. They ate in groups. They worked in groups. They prayed in groups. And moral behavior was monitored. Not always officially, but socially. Your neighbors watched you. Your village watched you. Your priest watched you. Your family watched you. And you watched them. Because medieval morality was not private. It was public. It was social. It was something people performed. And food, because it was visible, became one of the most obvious performances. This is why fasting rules mattered so much. Not because everyone believed in them equally. But because everyone could see whether you followed them. If it was Friday and you were eating meat, people noticed. If it was Lent and you were eating eggs, people noticed. If you were buying spices at the market, people noticed. If your kitchen smelled too good on a fasting day, people noticed. And the smell of spices was especially noticeable. Because spices travel. They drift. They float. They escape the pot. They fill the air. So spices were not just a private indulgence. They were an announcement. They told the world that you were eating richly. That you were making food enjoyable. That you were living with flavor. And living with flavor, in medieval moral imagination, suggested that you were living with temptation. Now, let's pause and consider something important. Spices were not only used for luxury. They were also used for preservation. Or at least, that's what modern people often say. The popular myth is that medieval people used spices to cover the taste of rotten meat. This is mostly nonsense. Not because medieval people were too refined, but because spices were expensive. You would not waste expensive spices on rotten meat. If you had rotten meat, you didn't cover it with pepper. You threw it away, if you could. Or you salted it. Or you smoked it. Or you ate it and hoped you survived. But spices were not cheap. Spices were not everyday. They were valuable. So their primary use, in most cases, was flavor. And flavor, again, was morally charged. Now, the next part of this story is where spices become truly medieval. Because now we have to talk about how spices entered Europe. How they traveled. How they were traded. How they were priced. How they were measured. How they were treated like treasure. Because spices were not just ingredients. They were currency. They were status objects. They were gifts. They were medicine. They were wealth you could carry in a small pouch. And when something is that valuable, it becomes morally complicated. Because medieval morality distrusted luxury. But medieval society also depended on luxury. Trade networks. Merchant wealth. Urban economies. Royal courts. All of these things relied on luxury goods. And spices were one of the most important luxury goods of all. So the medieval world had to live with spices. It had to accept them. It had to integrate them. Even while preaching against indulgence. Even while warning against pleasure. Even while insisting that restraint was virtuous. So spices became the perfect medieval contradiction. A thing that was publicly admired and privately feared. A thing that was used and condemned. A thing that was praised as medicine and mocked as vanity. A thing that was seen as proof of refinement and proof of moral weakness at the same time. And that contradiction is where the story becomes delicious. Because medieval Europe was full of contradictions. People preached poverty and lived in decorated churches. People preached humility and built enormous cathedrals. People preached fasting and invented elaborate fish feasts. People preached restraint and served spiced wine at banquets. People preached simplicity and wore embroidered clothing. People preached against luxury while secretly loving it. And spices were right in the center of that hypocrisy. So now, in the next part, we're going to leave the body for a moment and step into the world outside. The world of trade routes. Markets. Merchant ships. Caravans. Spice chests. Wealth. And the slow arrival of exotic flavor into medieval kitchens. Because spices were not just feared because they were hot. They were feared because they came from far away. From lands medieval Europeans imagined as strange, sensual, dangerous, and morally suspicious. And when you import your pleasure from a distant world, the pleasure becomes even more threatening. Because now it's not just your body. It's foreign influence. Foreign temptation. Foreign luxury. Foreign softness. And medieval Europe was always uneasy about foreign softness. Spices didn't enter medieval Europe quietly. They arrived the way rumors arrive. Slowly at first, and then suddenly everywhere, wrapped in mystery, expense, and moral suspicion. Because the moment something becomes rare, expensive, and desirable, medieval society did what it always did. It stopped asking, does this taste good? And started asking, what kind of person wants this? To most people in medieval Europe, food was simple. Bread. Porridge. Cabbage. Onions. A little cheese if you were lucky. A bit of salted fish if you were near a river or coast. Meat if you were having a good year, or if your landlord was feeling generous. The everyday medieval diet was not designed for pleasure. It was designed for survival. So when spices began to appear in noble kitchens, pepper, cinnamon, ginger, cloves, saffron, something about them felt unnatural. Not because they were evil, but because they were unnecessary. And in the medieval imagination, unnecessary comfort was always suspicious. Spices came from far away. So far away that many people didn't even have a clear idea where they came from. They came from the edges of the known world. From lands described in travel stories that sounded half real and half dream. The kind of places where the sun was hotter, the air was thicker, and everything grew in strange, powerful ways. To a medieval European, spices weren't just foreign. They were exotic in the most literal sense, outside normal life. Outside the moral routine. Outside the familiar rules. Which meant they didn't feel like food. They felt like temptation. And the thing about temptation in medieval thought was that it rarely arrived as something obviously wicked. It arrived as something delightful. Something that made you smile. Something that made your senses wake up. And medieval religion had a complicated relationship with the senses. The senses were doors. And doors, as everyone knows, let things in. Smell, taste, touch, all of these were treated like open windows in the walls of the soul. A window was fine. But you weren't supposed to lean out of it. You weren't supposed to stare too long. And you definitely weren't supposed to enjoy the view. So when spices entered the medieval kitchen, they didn't feel like a harmless upgrade. They felt like someone had brought perfume into a monastery. The other reason spices caused anxiety was the simplest one. They were expensive. Extremely expensive. A sack of pepper could cost a shocking amount. Saffron was practically a treasure. Cinnamon and cloves were not things you used casually. They were things you displayed. And medieval society, like modern society, did not handle displays of wealth in a calm and healthy way. Because wealth wasn't just money. It was moral noise. If you were poor, you were supposed to be humble. If you were rich, you were supposed to be responsible. And if you were rich and irresponsible, well, that was a spiritual scandal waiting to happen. A nobleman eating meat on a feast day was one thing. A nobleman eating meat with cinnamon, ginger, and pepper was something else entirely. That wasn't hunger. That was performance. That was pleasure. That was the kind of eating that made a person look like they were enjoying themselves. And enjoying yourself too openly was dangerous. Not because medieval people didn't like pleasure. They did. They liked it very much. Which is why they feared it. Because they believed pleasure was sticky. Once it touched you, it stayed. It softened you. It made you crave more. And then you started arranging your life around cravings instead of virtue. And that, in their mind, was how the soul slipped. Not with dramatic crimes, but with small comforts. The other problem with spices was that they didn't behave like normal medieval foods. They didn't grow in local fields. You couldn't just walk outside and see where they came from. You couldn't watch them being harvested. You couldn't understand them through ordinary labor. And anything that existed outside the familiar cycle of work and seasons felt suspicious. Medieval morality was built on effort. The harder something was to get, the more it mattered. But spices were a strange kind of hard. Not hard in a noble, honest way, like chopping wood or harvesting wheat. Hard in an invisible way. Hard because it involved ships and trade routes and foreign merchants and money. Hard because it involved a world that most medieval people never saw. Which meant spices carried an aura. Not just of wealth, but of the unknown. And the unknown was always a little demonic, or at least spiritually unstable. A medieval person didn't need proof that spices were dangerous. The fact that they were distant, rare, and pleasurable was enough. And once spices were associated with wealth, the next association came naturally. Spices became linked with softness. With indulgence. With the kind of living that made your body too comfortable. And in medieval thinking, a comfortable body was a spiritually risky body. Because discomfort was seen as a kind of discipline. If your life was hard, you were less likely to become arrogant. If your food was bland, you were less likely to become greedy. If your days were tiring, you were less likely to become lustful. The medieval ideal was not happiness. It was restraint. So spices were not just flavor. They were a symbol. A symbol of excess. A symbol of temptation. A symbol of a person who had enough time, money, and freedom to care about taste. And caring about taste was a moral problem. Because taste is pleasure. And pleasure is the beginning of a slippery slope. A person who begins seasoning their food might begin seasoning their life. And once you start seasoning your life, you might stop wanting suffering. And once you stop wanting suffering, you might start questioning why suffering was necessary at all. And at that point, the entire medieval system begins to shake. Because medieval society was not built on comfort. It was built on endurance. Which is why spices, of all things, caused such anxiety. Not because they were poisonous. Not because they were magical. But because they made food feel too good. And when food felt too good, medieval people did what they always did. They looked at the table. And saw a moral battlefield. And that was only the beginning. Because soon, spices would stop being just a luxury. They would become a spiritual argument. A debate about the senses. A debate about the body. And, most importantly, a debate about desire. And medieval Europe had never been calm about desire. Once spices entered medieval Europe, the fear didn't stay in the kitchen. It moved into the body. Because medieval people did not believe the body was neutral. They believed the body was a machine of temptation. A creature that constantly leaned toward comfort, pleasure, and sin, unless it was held back by discipline. And spices, unfortunately, were the kind of thing that seemed to bypass discipline. They didn't just fill the stomach. They woke the senses. They made the mouth notice itself. They made the nose pay attention. They made eating feel less like survival. And more like enjoyment. And medieval morality was never relaxed about enjoyment. Especially not the kind that made the body feel warm. Because warmth, in medieval thought, was never just warmth. It was a sign. A sign that something was being stirred. Something internal. Something hidden. Something dangerous. To understand why spices became connected to lust, you have to understand one of the most powerful medieval ideas. The belief that food controlled personality. Not metaphorically. Literally. Medieval Europe inherited a medical system that was built around the four humors. Blood. Phlegm. Yellow bile. Black bile. And these humors were not just fluids. They were the explanation for everything. Your mood. Your energy. Your desires. Your health. Your temper. Your sadness. Your courage. Your laziness. If you were calm, it meant your humors were balanced. If you were angry, it meant your humors were out of balance. If you were lustful, well, that meant your humors were definitely out of balance. And the fastest way to change your humors was through food. Food was chemistry. Food was behavior. Food was spiritual risk. This meant that eating was never a small act. Every meal was an experiment. And every experiment could go wrong. Spices were especially suspicious because they were considered hot. Not just spicy hot. Hot in the medical sense. They were thought to heat the body, quicken the blood, sharpen the senses, and increase internal motion. And internal motion was dangerous. Because internal motion meant desire. Desire was not treated as a simple feeling. It was treated like a creature. Something alive. Something that grew. Something that demanded more. The medieval mind loved the slippery slope. Because it was the perfect moral structure. It made small pleasures terrifying. If you ate a rich meal today, you might crave one tomorrow. If you craved one tomorrow, you might become greedy. If you became greedy, you might start stealing. If you started stealing, you might stop praying. If you stopped praying, you might stop fearing God. And once you stop fearing God, well, at that point, your soul is basically walking around unsupervised. So spices became dangerous not because they were sinful by nature, but because they were seen as a trigger. A spark. A match near dry straw. And medieval culture was full of dry straw. People were already anxious about the senses. They were already anxious about the body. They were already anxious about sex. Spices simply gave them a new object to attach that anxiety to. A new scapegoat. A new villain. And it was the perfect villain because it was subtle. Spices didn't make you drunk like wine. They didn't make you lose control immediately. They made you feel slightly more alive. Slightly more awake. Slightly more pleased. And that was exactly the problem. Medieval moral systems were not built around dramatic sins. They were built around tiny corruptions. The quiet erosion of discipline. The slow softening of the will. The moment when a person stops resisting. And spices were, in their minds, the beginning of that moment. There is a reason medieval sermons and moral writing spent so much time talking about appetite. Appetite was not just hunger. Appetite was the model for all desire. If you could not control your appetite for food, how could you control your appetite for anything else? Food was practice. Eating was rehearsal. The table was a training ground. And spices turned the training ground into a festival. Because spices made the meal feel special. And special meals were emotionally dangerous. A plain meal could be endured. A plain meal could be eaten with humility. But a meal with spices invited attention. It invited enjoyment. It invited delight. And delight was a slippery substance. Once it entered a person, it tended to spread. So medieval writers began connecting spices to lust. Not in a silly way. In a serious, almost clinical way. They believed that hot foods made the body more active. That activity meant more blood. More blood meant more heat. More heat meant more desire. And desire, in medieval thought, was not a harmless internal preference. Desire was the enemy. Desire was the serpent. Desire was the whisper that convinced a person to abandon discipline. This is why medieval moral logic often sounds extreme to modern ears. Because it doesn't treat lust as a normal human feeling. It treats lust as a spiritual infection. Something that enters the body and spreads. Something that must be prevented rather than managed. And food, unfortunately, was one of the easiest ways for infection to enter. Because everyone eats. Everyone has to. You can't avoid food the way you can avoid crime. You can't avoid food the way you can avoid temptation in a marketplace. Food comes to you. It enters you. It becomes you. So medieval people became obsessed with the idea that what you eat becomes what you are. Which means spices were not just seasoning. They were identity. They were transformation. They were the moment when a person's internal balance could be tipped toward indulgence. And the fear wasn't entirely imaginary. Spices did change the experience of eating. A spiced meal did feel richer. It did feel warmer. It did feel more stimulating. If you had lived your whole life eating bland porridge, a spiced stew would feel like a revelation. Like the world had suddenly become more vivid. The world was supposed to be endured. A medieval Christian life was often framed as a journey through suffering. A temporary struggle before eternal reward. Which meant that too much pleasure here and now could be interpreted as suspicious. Almost like cheating. Almost like taking your reward early. And medieval culture hated the idea of taking rewards early. Because that implied impatience. And impatience implied pride. And pride was the most dangerous sin of all. So spices became tied to a strange moral fear. The fear that a person might start liking the world too much. That they might start enjoying the body too much. That they might start wanting life to be comfortable. And comfort, in medieval spirituality, was not the goal. It was the trap. This is also why spices became linked with the wealthy. Because wealth created comfort. Comfort created softness. Softness created desire. And desire created sin. It was all connected. The medieval mind loved connections. It loved chains of cause and effect. And once spices entered the chain, they could not escape it. A nobleman eating cinnamon wasn't just eating cinnamon. He was declaring something. He was declaring that his senses mattered. That his pleasure mattered. That his life was not merely a test of discipline. And that declaration was spiritually loud. A monk eating spiced food was even worse. Because monks were supposed to be professionals of restraint. If a monk wanted spices, then what hope did ordinary people have? So the anxiety grew. Spices began to symbolize moral danger. Not because they were evil. But because they made the body feel too alive. And medieval Europe was terrified of a body that felt alive. Because a body that felt alive was a body that might start asking for more. And once the body starts asking, the soul begins negotiating. And medieval religion did not trust negotiation. It trusted obedience. So spices were treated like the beginning of a negotiation. A small compromise. A tiny surrender. And medieval people knew, better than anyone, how small surrenders accumulate. Because their entire moral system was built on the idea that sin rarely arrives like a thunderstorm. Sin arrives like seasoning. A pinch at a time. A little warmth. A little sweetness. A little pleasure. And then, one day, you look down at your life. And realize you have become someone who enjoys things. Which, in medieval Europe, was dangerously close to becoming someone who stops fearing God. And that was the nightmare. Not hunger. Not poverty. Not war. Not disease. The nightmare was that a person might be happy. And not feel guilty about it. In medieval Europe, spices were not just a moral problem. They were a social problem. Because flavor wasn't only about pleasure. Flavor was about status. And medieval society was obsessed with status. Not in the modern way where people flex subtly with brands. In medieval Europe, status was life and death. It determined where you lived. What you ate. What you wore. Who respected you. Who could punish you. And who could ignore you. So when spices became popular among the wealthy, they didn't just become suspicious spiritually. They became offensive socially. Because spices were expensive. Most of them had traveled across deserts, seas, and empires. They had been handled by merchants, taxed by officials, resold, and finally brought into Europe like little fragments of the outside world. They were rare. They were valuable. And they were, most importantly, unnecessary. That last part mattered. Medieval morality had a deep distrust of anything unnecessary. Necessary things were allowed. Necessary things were humble. Necessary things were safe. But unnecessary things were indulgence. And indulgence always had moral consequences. Spices were the definition of unnecessary. You didn't need pepper to survive. You didn't need cinnamon to endure winter. You didn't need cloves to keep your soul intact. Spices existed for one purpose. To make food enjoyable. And if your food was enjoyable, the medieval mind asked a very uncomfortable question. Why? Why are you enjoying yourself? What exactly do you think this life is? A picnic? A celebration? A reward? No. This life was supposed to be a test. So spices became a kind of insult. A wealthy person seasoning their food was not just eating. They were declaring that they deserved pleasure. That their senses mattered. That their meals should be interesting. That their body should be entertained. And in medieval society, this was not just morally suspicious. It was socially aggressive. Because peasants were eating bland bread. Thin porridge. Vegetables boiled until they surrendered. Occasional bits of salted fish if they were lucky. Their meals were survival. Their meals were repetition. Their meals were not supposed to be exciting. So when the wealthy ate spiced dishes, it wasn't just pleasure. It was a public performance of privilege. A way of saying, my life is not about endurance. My life is about taste. And taste was dangerous. Because taste is never just taste. Taste implies choice. And choice implies freedom. And medieval society did not like the idea that some people had more freedom than others. Not openly. Not too loudly. But spices made the inequality obvious. A nobleman didn't just eat bread. He ate white bread. A nobleman didn't just eat meat. He ate meat with sauce. A nobleman didn't just eat fish. He ate fish that had been transformed into something luxurious. And the luxury wasn't only in the ingredients. It was in the care. The time. The labor. The fact that someone else had worked to make his meal more pleasant. So spices became a symbol. Not just of indulgence. But of power. Because only powerful people could afford to make food fun. Poor people didn't have the luxury of fun. They had the luxury of not starving. So spices became part of a larger medieval fear. The fear that wealth softened people. That comfort made them arrogant. That privilege made them forget God. And the wealthy, unfortunately, did not help their case. Because medieval elites often loved to show off. They held feasts. They hosted banquets. They served dishes that were designed to impress. And medieval feasts were not quiet. They were theatrical. There were multiple courses. There were exotic foods. There were elaborate presentations. Sometimes there were dishes shaped like animals. Or birds served with their feathers reattached. Food was not only eaten. Food was displayed. And spices were part of the display. A dish spiced with saffron wasn't just flavorful. It was yellow gold. It looked expensive. It looked rare. It looked like wealth. It looked like the kind of meal you could only eat if you had money. And money, in medieval Christianity, was always suspicious. Because money had a reputation. It was linked to greed. To pride. To corruption. To soft living. To a life too comfortable to produce holiness. So when a wealthy person used spices, it wasn't just culinary. It was moral theater. It was a visible sign that this person had resources to spare. And medieval morality hated spare resources. Because spare resources could be given to the poor. Spare resources could be used for charity. Spare resources could be offered to the church. But instead, they were being used to make dinner more interesting. Which made the wealthy look selfish. Not necessarily in the modern sense. But in the medieval sense. In the medieval sense, selfishness was not just keeping too much. It was enjoying too much. Enjoyment implied attachment. Attachment implied weakness. And weakness implied spiritual danger. This is why medieval sermons often targeted wealthy dining. Not because the church hated food. The church loved food. The church was filled with people who understood how to eat very well. But the church hated what food represented. Food represented the body winning. Food represented the senses being rewarded. Food represented pleasure without suffering. And pleasure without suffering was, in medieval logic, deeply suspicious. To avoid extravagance. To avoid luxurious sauces. To avoid excessive spices. To avoid making meals too pleasurable. But wealthy people, of course, did not always listen. Because wealth is rarely humble. And medieval wealth was especially bold. So what happened? A strange compromise. Wealthy people began to justify spices in a way that made them sound less indulgent. They claimed spices were medicinal. They claimed spices helped digestion. They claimed spices balanced the humors. They claimed spices prevented illness. They claimed spices were necessary for health. And medieval medicine was extremely convenient. Because medieval medicine could justify almost anything. If you wanted something, you could usually find a doctor who would argue that it was good for your humors. So spices became medicine. Not officially. Not always. But often enough. And this allowed wealthy people to keep enjoying them while pretending they weren't enjoying them. This was one of medieval society's greatest talents. Indulgence disguised as discipline. Luxury disguised as necessity. Pleasure disguised as responsibility. A rich man could eat peppered meat and claim it was for digestion. A noble woman could drink spiced wine and claim it was for her health. A monk could request better food and claim he was weak. And weakness, conveniently, was always happening right around dinner. This is what made medieval food culture so stressful. Everything had to be justified. Everything had to be moral. Everything had to be explained in a way that sounded humble. Even when it was obviously indulgent. So spices became a symbol of a wider medieval hypocrisy. A system where the poor were told to accept suffering as virtue, while the rich found ways to make their suffering taste like cinnamon. And yet, even the wealthy could not fully escape the guilt. Because medieval Christianity was extremely good at producing guilt. Guilt was the most renewable resource in Europe. A rich person could eat spiced food, but they were still told to fear it. They were still warned that pleasure weakened the soul. They were still reminded that comfort was dangerous. So even at the richest tables, there was a shadow. A shadow of moral suspicion. A whisper that said, "Yes, this is delicious, but what is it doing to you?" Because the medieval mind could not accept that pleasure might be harmless. Pleasure had to be suspicious. Pleasure had to be monitored. Pleasure had to be paid for with guilt. So spices became both a luxury and a threat. A sign of status. And a sign of spiritual risk. And the strange truth is this. Spices did not just season food. They seasoned medieval society itself. They sharpened class divisions. They exposed privilege. They created moral debates. They made people anxious about what they were enjoying. And they reminded everyone, rich or poor, that in medieval Europe, even dinner was never just dinner. Dinner was a public statement. Dinner was a moral test. Dinner was a spiritual performance. And spices were the evidence. If medieval Europe had one group of people who should have been immune to food temptation, it was monks. Monks were supposed to be the professionals of restraint. They lived in communities designed to remove distractions. They prayed constantly. They worked. They obeyed strict rules. They owned little. They were, in theory, the safest people in Europe from the moral dangers of pleasure. And yet, monasteries became some of the most creative food loophole factories in medieval history. Because nothing inspires culinary innovation quite like being told you are not allowed to enjoy dinner. The medieval church was obsessed with fasting. Fasting was not treated as a small personal habit. It was treated as a weapon. A spiritual weapon. A tool to weaken the body so the soul could become stronger. The logic was simple. If the body is comfortable, it becomes rebellious. If the body is hungry, it becomes obedient. Hunger was supposed to make you humble. Hunger was supposed to make you prayerful. Hunger was supposed to remind you that this world is temporary. But the body had other ideas. The body wanted to live. The body wanted energy. The body wanted warmth. The body wanted something that tasted like more than boiled disappointment. So the medieval church created an enormous system of food restrictions. No meat on Fridays. No meat during Lent. No meat on vigils. No meat on fasting days. Sometimes no dairy. Sometimes no eggs. Sometimes no animal products at all. And the calendar was filled with these days. So much so that medieval people spent a shocking amount of time checking whether dinner was legally safe. It's hard to relax when your stew might technically be a sin. Now, ordinary peasants dealt with fasting in a simple way. They just ate less. They ate bland food. They endured it. They didn't have many options. But monasteries were different. Monasteries had land. Monasteries had gardens. Monasteries had skilled cooks. Monasteries had fish ponds. Monasteries had resources. And most importantly, monasteries had rules. Rules that could be interpreted. And medieval people loved interpreting rules. Especially when interpretation could lead to a better meal. So monks became experts in the art of obeying the letter of the law while quietly ignoring its spirit. The most famous loophole food, of course, was fish. Fish was the official fasting food. Fish was not considered meat. The church had decided this. And medieval people accepted it, even though fish is clearly an animal. But theological logic is not always interested in biology. Fish was allowed. So monasteries invested heavily in fish. They built ponds. They stocked them. They managed them. They protected them. Some monasteries became essentially fish corporations. And once they had fish, they made it delicious. Which was not supposed to happen. Fish was supposed to be dull. Fish was supposed to feel like sacrifice. Fish was supposed to remind you that you were fasting. But monks had cooks. And cooks have pride. So fish was turned into stews. Fish was baked. Fish was seasoned. Fish was served with sauces. Fish was made to taste like something you might actually want. And the moment fasting food becomes desirable, you are no longer fasting. You are simply eating something else. But the medieval church often struggled to confront this. Because technically, the monks were obeying. They weren't eating meat. They were eating fish. And fish was allowed. So the loophole remained. And it grew. But fish wasn't the only loophole. Medieval monks had a whole system of clever reclassification. If something was medicinal, it often escaped restriction. This created a very convenient habit. Monks were frequently ill. Not dramatically ill. Not visibly dying. Just tired. Weak. Low energy. Needing nourishment. And the monastery rulebooks often allowed exceptions for the sick. So a monk could be given eggs. Or cheese. Or better bread. Or richer food. Not because he wanted it. But because he was weak. And weakness, mysteriously, became extremely common. Especially around meal times. Even better, monks also used the idea of liquids. Some monastic rules were stricter about meat than they were about broths. So monks found ways to consume animal richness through soup. A meat broth could be argued as not fully meat. It was just the essence. The spirit. The ghost of meat. And the medieval mind loved the technicality. Some monasteries even debated whether eating meat in a liquid form was less sinful. Which is one of the most medieval arguments imaginable. Imagine someone seriously debating the morality of meat water. But that's exactly what happened. Then there were pastries. This is where things get even more amusing. Because medieval fasting restrictions often focused on obvious indulgences. Meat. Dairy. Eggs. But medieval cooks were skilled at hiding ingredients. Eggs could disappear into dough. Milk could be disguised in sauces. Butter could be replaced with oil. And suddenly, a fasting meal could look suspiciously luxurious. This created what you might call the medieval fasting paradox. The more rules you create, the more creative people become at breaking them without admitting it. And monks were some of the most creative. Because monks were not starving peasants. They were disciplined men with access to food. So their fasting became refined. Instead of eating less, they ate differently. They ate legal meals that were still satisfying. Sometimes extremely satisfying. And the monastery dining table became a place of quiet contradiction. Because on the surface, everyone was humble. Everyone was obedient. Everyone was fasting. But the plates told another story. And the church knew this. Medieval moral writers complained constantly about monastic dining. They accused monks of living too comfortably. They accused monasteries of becoming lazy. They accused monks of enjoying food too much. They warned that monks were turning fasting into a culinary sport. And in many cases, they were. Because fasting wasn't just spiritual. It was social. It was also a way to display discipline. And monks were expected to be the highest example of discipline. So when monks found loopholes, it caused anxiety. Not only because it was morally suspicious, but because it undermined the whole system. If monks, the professionals of holiness, could not fast properly, then what hope did ordinary people have? So the church responded with more rules, more restrictions, more guidance, more warnings. And the monasteries responded with more creativity. This was the medieval arms race. Rules versus appetite. And appetite usually won. Quietly. Politely. With a bowl of fish stew that tasted suspiciously like a feast. This is why medieval fasting was often less about suffering, and more about performance. People were expected to look restrained, to appear disciplined, to eat in a way that communicated humility. But inside that performance, there was often negotiation, loopholes, exceptions, technicalities. Because medieval life was hard. And even monks, who were trained to endure hardship, still wanted dinner to be tolerable, still wanted warmth, still wanted comfort, still wanted something that didn't feel like punishment. And that's the strange truth. Medieval Europe feared food because food was powerful. Food made people feel alive. Food made people comfortable. Food made people less miserable. And misery was, in many medieval minds, spiritually useful. So the church tried to control food. And people, including monks, found ways around that control. Because the body, no matter how holy the soul claims to be, still wants to eat, still wants to enjoy, still wants to live. And medieval Europe spent centuries trying to pretend otherwise. If spices were the flashy villain of medieval dining, bread was the quiet one. Bread didn't arrive from exotic lands. Bread didn't sparkle with wealth. Bread didn't announce itself like saffron or pepper. Bread was normal. Bread was daily. Bread was everywhere. And that's exactly why it became one of the most powerful moral symbols in medieval Europe. Because bread wasn't just food. Bread was identity. Bread told people who you were, what class you belonged to, what kind of life you lived, and most importantly, how much comfort you were allowed to have. Medieval society didn't only divide people by wealth. It divided people by hardship. Hardship was not just a condition. It was a moral expectation. If you were poor, you were expected to endure. If you were rich, you were expected to restrain yourself. And bread became the perfect way to judge whether someone was living too softly. Because bread came in two main moral categories: dark bread and white bread. Dark bread was coarse, heavy, full of bran, often mixed with barley, rye, or whatever grain was available. Sometimes it was so dense it felt like a brick. Sometimes it was stale. Sometimes it was sour. Sometimes it tasted like survival. And medieval thinkers liked that. Because discomfort was virtuous. Dark bread required effort to chew. It filled you, but it didn't comfort you. It reminded you that life was hard. And medieval morality believed life was supposed to be hard. White bread, on the other hand, was dangerously pleasant. White bread was made from finely sifted wheat flour. To make it, you needed time, labor, and money. You needed grain good enough to waste. You needed servants to sift flour again and again. You needed a baker skilled enough to produce a loaf that was soft and pale. And when it arrived on the table, it looked like luxury. It looked like ease. It looked like the kind of food that did not want you to suffer. And that was the problem. Because medieval morality distrusted ease. Ease made people weak. Ease made people lazy. Ease made people forget God. So white bread became morally loaded. Not because it was evil. Not because it was forbidden. But because it symbolized a dangerous idea. That a human being deserved comfort. And medieval spirituality was never fully comfortable with that idea. White bread was often eaten by nobles, by wealthy merchants, by people who lived in warm houses, people who had blankets, people who had servants, people whose lives were not built around physical labor. And because medieval society was obsessed with moral balance, wealth always had to come with suspicion. If you had more than others, you were assumed to be at risk of pride, at risk of greed, at risk of softness. And white bread became the edible proof of that softness. A person eating white bread was not just eating. They were making a statement. They were declaring that they preferred life to be easy. And medieval moral thinkers hated that. Because in their worldview, life was a spiritual battlefield. The soul was supposed to struggle. The body was supposed to be disciplined. The world was supposed to be endured. So any food that made the world feel gentler was suspicious. White bread didn't just fill the stomach. It soothed the mind. It was comforting. And comfort was dangerous. Comfort made people stop striving. Comfort made people stop praying as hard. Comfort made people stop fearing. And fear, in medieval Christianity, was often treated as spiritually useful. A person who feared God was obedient. A person who feared sin was cautious. A person who feared punishment was disciplined. But a person who felt comfortable might stop fearing. And a person who stops fearing might start enjoying. And enjoyment was the enemy. So white bread became part of a larger medieval obsession. The fear of soft living. Soft living was not just a lifestyle. It was a spiritual hazard. The church warned constantly against luxury. Not because luxury itself was always sinful, but because luxury changed people. It softened them. It made them expect comfort. It made them impatient with hardship. It made them forget that suffering was supposed to be meaningful. So bread became a moral test. Not a dramatic one. A quiet one. A daily one. What kind of bread do you eat? Do you eat the bread that reminds you of labor? Or do you eat the bread that feels like privilege? And the funny part is, white bread wasn't even healthier. It wasn't nutritionally superior. It was just easier. Softer. Less rough. Less demanding. And medieval morality often valued demanding food. Food was supposed to be a reminder. A reminder of humility. A reminder of struggle. A reminder that you were not entitled to comfort. So even wealthy people were sometimes encouraged to eat dark bread. As a performance. As a symbol of humility. A nobleman could eat coarse bread publicly to show restraint. A wealthy woman could refuse white bread to show piety. It became part of social theater. Not just eating, but communicating virtue. Because medieval society loved visible virtue. It wasn't enough to be disciplined. You had to look disciplined. You had to appear humble. You had to perform restraint. And bread was the easiest way to perform it. Now, wine played a similar role. Wine was everywhere in medieval Europe. It was safer than water in many places. It was common. But wine was also morally dangerous. Because wine didn't just nourish. Wine changed mood. Wine loosened restraint. Wine made people talk too freely. Wine made people laugh. Wine made people forget guilt. And forgetting guilt was always dangerous. Medieval people did not fear drunkenness in the modern sense. They feared what drunkenness represented. Loss of control. Loss of discipline. A weakening of the will. A surrender of the soul's authority over the body. Wine was suspicious because it could make a person feel joy without permission. And medieval morality did not like unauthorized joy. So wine was allowed. But heavily monitored. A person could drink wine, but not too eagerly. A person could enjoy wine, but not too visibly. A person could praise wine, but not too passionately. Because passion itself was suspicious. Especially passion for something that wasn't God. Wine was also tied to class. The poor often drank weaker ale. The wealthy drank finer wine. And finer wine was smoother, sweeter, more pleasant, less harsh. Which meant it was, once again, dangerously comfortable. So the same moral logic applied. The smoother the food, the more suspicious it became. Harsh bread was humble. Smooth bread was dangerous. Harsh drink was ordinary. Smooth wine was indulgence. Medieval morality was obsessed with roughness, because roughness was proof of hardship. And hardship was proof of virtue. So even the simplest foods became symbols.